Tonight, when you pour yourself a glass of wine to finally unwind, you are blindly participating in an ancient ritual. 99.9% of people believe this simple act is the ultimate symbol of a civilized human society. You picture a refined history of cultured ancestors carefully cultivating vineyards to celebrate their safe escape from the harsh wilderness. But you are completely wrong about everything here. That comforting liquid in your hand wasn't born from civilization and safety. It was actually forged in the darkest, most terrifying depths of our prehistoric survival. When we think about the invention of alcohol, we almost always picture a turning point in human sophistication. We imagine a time when our ancestors finally stopped running from predators, put down their spears, and decided to plant seeds in the dirt. We associate the creation of these drinks with the birth of agriculture, the building of permanent settlements, and the sudden luxury of free time. You probably picture ancient Roman emperors reclining on marble couches, raising golden goblets filled with deep red wine to toast their sprawling conquests. Or perhaps you visualize quiet medieval monks hidden away in stone monasteries, carefully tending to bubbling wooden vats of ale while meticulously recording their recipes on parchment. We are taught from a very young age to believe that intoxicating beverages are the absolute ultimate reward of a highly civilized society, a pure luxury product born directly from our total mastery over nature. We think that first came the farms, then came the cities, and finally, as a byproduct of our surplus grain and peaceful stability, came the brew. It feels entirely logical. It makes perfect sense. It paints a comforting picture of human progress marching in a straight, orderly line from savage survival to refined indulgence. We view a glass of wine or a pint of beer as the crowning achievement of settling down. For centuries, this has been the accepted timeline. We assume that before we built walls and cultivated wheat, our ancestors were far too busy merely trying to stay alive in a brutal, unforgiving wilderness to even consider fermenting anything. The very idea of early nomadic humans having the time, the tools, or the understanding to brew alcohol seems completely absurd to our modern minds. We have convinced ourselves that alcohol required civilization to exist. We have built an entire historical narrative around this comfortable sequence of events, teaching it in classrooms and repeating it in documentaries as if it were an absolute, undeniable truth of our shared human heritage. It is a beautiful narrative of progress. It tells us exactly what we want to hear about our own cleverness and our steady rise above the chaotic savagery of the natural world. We believe that we tamed the wild, and then we rewarded ourselves with a drink. This is the story we all know. This is the timeline we all trust. But that entire story is a lie. And here's the part nobody talks about. To understand why you actually drink, we have to completely abandon the comfortable idea of human civilization. We have to rewind the clock far past the ancient Romans, past the medieval monks, past the very first agricultural settlements where we supposedly learned to farm. We have to go back 10 million years. Picture an incredibly dense prehistoric canopy. Long before we even possessed the biological hardware to call ourselves human, our ancient primate ancestors lived almost exclusively high up in the branches. Their diet was simple. They ate fresh, sweet, untouched fruit swinging safely above the forest floor. But then the global climate environment radically shifted. Food in the high canopy became incredibly scarce. For the very first time in our evolutionary history, these early primates were desperately forced to climb down from the absolute safety of the branches and forage on the dark, terrifying forest floor. Down there in the shadows, the fruit wasn't fresh anymore. It was heavily bruised. It was massively overripe. It lay rotting in the humid dirt, naturally swarming with hungry bacteria and yeast. As this fallen fruit decayed under the intense prehistoric sun, the wild yeast rapidly consumed its natural sugars and produced a highly specific, deeply toxic chemical byproduct, ethanol alcohol. To almost all other animals in the wild, this rotting, fermented mass was pure poison. Eating it meant terrible sickness. Sickness meant physical weakness. And in the primordial jungle, physical weakness meant you were instantly eaten by predators. But our ancestors were desperately starving. They absolutely needed the concentrated calories permanently trapped inside that decaying fruit just to survive another day. This is exactly where the story shifts from a desperate struggle to a massive, totally unpredictable biological lottery. A groundbreaking study, officially published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, revealed something completely astonishing about our deepest DNA. Around 10 million years ago, our primate ancestors experienced a sudden, totally random genetic mutation. It was a tiny microscopic alteration in a specific evolutionary gene called ADH4. Overnight, in the grand sprawling timeline of evolutionary history, this single genetic mutation dramatically changed how their bodies physically processed food. It instantly gave them the unprecedented biological ability to break down and safely metabolize strong ethanol. They could suddenly digest the intoxicating, highly alcoholic fruit rotting on the forest floor without dying from the toxins. This wasn't a luxury. This was a brutal, highly calculated survival mechanism. Those specific primates who carried this newly mutated gene could immediately access a massive, entirely new caloric food source that every other competing animal had to leave entirely alone. They ate the fermented fruit. They survived the brutal famines. They lived long enough to reproduce. And over thousands of generations, this incredibly unique biological ability to naturally process alcohol became permanently hardwired into our physiological makeup. The primates who couldn't process ethanol slowly starved and rapidly faded away into extinction. The primates who could process ethanol survived, thrived, and eventually evolved directly into us. Think deeply about the immense, terrifying weight of that biological reality for a second. Your specific ability to process a simple glass of wine tonight is definitely not a refined, highly civilized cultural trait you acquired a few thousand years ago. It is a deeply ancient, absolutely desperate survival mechanism permanently written directly into your blood. We did not invent alcohol as a wonderful celebratory reward for finally conquering the wild. We genetically adapted to it simply because we were starving to death in the dirt. We didn't domesticate alcohol. Alcohol completely domesticated us. But here's what's fascinating. The biological ability to process alcohol kept our earliest ancestors alive in the harsh primordial jungle, but it didn't build the modern world. For millions of years, we remained nomadic. We constantly moved across the landscape, hunting wild game, gathering wild plants, entirely dependent on the unpredictable rhythms of nature. We were survivors, but we were not yet a civilization. Then, something profound and completely unexpected happened. We stopped moving. We put down roots. We started building massive stone structures and deliberately planting seeds in the ground. For centuries, every history textbook has confidently claimed that this monumental shift happened because of bread. We are taught that early humans realized they could domesticate wild wheat, secure a reliable food supply, and finally escape the constant threat of starvation. We assume that agriculture was a perfectly rational, highly practical decision aimed purely at basic survival. But the archaeological record reveals a completely different, incredibly staggering reality. We didn't settle down to bake bread. We settled down to brew beer. To fully grasp the massive weight of this truth, you have to look at one of the most mysterious and ancient places on the entire planet. Deep in the rugged, sun-baked landscape of modern-day Turkey sits Göbekli Tepe. This is a sprawling, monumental complex built right at the very dawn of the Neolithic period. Picture massive, imposing stone pillars, rising high into the ancient sky, intricately carved with terrifying images of deadly predators. This place was constructed at the dawn of time. That is long before the invention of the wheel, long before written language, and thousands of years before the very first agricultural farms officially existed. This was a place of deep, profound ritual. And according to groundbreaking research officially published by Cambridge University in the prestigious journal Antiquity, it was also the site of incredibly massive, highly organized communal feasts. But they were not just eating. The researchers discovered large, deeply carved stone vats permanently installed directly into the ancient site. Through meticulous chemical analysis, they found undeniable, hard evidence of early fermentation inside these massive vessels. These primitive hunter-gatherers were deliberately gathering vast amounts of wild, uncultivated grains, hauling them up to this sacred hilltop, and intentionally brewing massive quantities of primitive beer. This completely shatters our entire understanding of human history. These massive, intoxicating feasts were deeply ceremonial, powerfully binding these early nomadic communities together in a shared, altered state of consciousness. The social and spiritual pull of these massive gatherings was so incredibly strong that gathering wild grain simply wasn't enough anymore. They needed more. They needed a constant, reliable supply of grain just to sustain these massive, alcohol-fueled religious rituals. So they began to experiment. They began to actively plant the wild grain in the fertile dirt. They began to deliberately farm. Agriculture was not invented as a highly practical, logical solution to global hunger or a simple desire for daily bread. It was directly invented to secure a steady, unending supply of alcohol for these sacred communal rituals. We did not build human civilization and then eventually discover the pleasant, incredible luxury of brewing. The intense, deep-seated desire to brew alcohol is the exact biological and deep cultural reason we built civilization in the very first place. It was the ultimate catalyst. It was the very foundation of human community. Alcohol did not follow the first permanent settlements. It demanded them. It forced us to finally put down our hunting spears, pick up the very first primitive plows, and completely restructure the entire natural world to serve our profound ancient thirst. So look closely at that quiet glass of wine in your hand tonight. You always believed it was just a highly sophisticated reward for finally conquering the wild. You thought it was the ultimate taste of human freedom. But what if it is the exact opposite? What if intoxication was never our clever way to eventually escape the massive, exhausting burdens of modern civilization? What if that comforting buzz is actually the terrifying biological trap that forced us into building it in the very first place? We traded the infinite wild for a drink. Welcome to Strange Origins, where we decode the weirdest, most obscure human beginnings.